August 6, 1945. A quiet morning in Tokyo's Imperial General Headquarters. In the depths of a fortified bunker, Japan's top military minds gathered for what they thought would be another routine briefing on a war they still believed they could endure. But at exactly 8:15 a.m., a frantic officer shattered the calm, clutching a decoded message from Hiroshima that would unravel their entire worldview. What if everything you thought you knew about your enemy was a carefully crafted illusion? What if the greatest power in the world had been hiding its true strength all along? This is the untold story of how one fateful transmission forced Japan's leaders to face a reality more profound than defeat. It revealed a civilization operating on an unimaginable scale. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace, 90 feet underground, the war room was a fortress of concrete and strategy. Field Marshal Shunryu Hata presided over the morning session, his staff poring over maps and reports of American advances in the Pacific. The air was thick with the scent of ink and tension, a familiar backdrop to years of calculated defiance. Japan had built its empire on the belief that unyielding spirit could triumph over material might. They had seen American factories churn out ships and planes, but convinced themselves that sheer willpower would prevail. That morning, however, would expose the fragility of those convictions. Lieutenant Colonel Takeshi Yamamoto entered without protocol, his face pale as he handed over the intercepted dispatch. The words were stark: Hiroshima obliterated by a single explosive device. Devastation beyond comprehension. Unknown technology. All contact lost mid-report. General Yashijiro Yumizu, chief of the Imperial General Staff, scanned it repeatedly, his mind racing to rationalize. Surely this was the result of a massive aerial assault, hundreds of B-29 bombers unleashing hellfire. Hiroshima, a bustling port city of over 350,000 souls, couldn't vanish from one strike. The math didn't add up. Yet, as follow-up reconnaissance trickled in, the impossible became clear. Only 3 American planes had been spotted in the skies that day. 3, not a fleet, not an armada. Just 3. Admiral Somu Toyota, head of the Naval General Staff, stared at the Pacific Theater map, where pins marked every tracked U.S. asset. His team had mastered predicting enemy moves from bomber payloads to raid patterns. Nothing in their exhaustive records hinted at this capability. By mid-morning, pilots returning from scouting runs described a colossal cloud formation unlike any before. A towering mushroom blooming to 50,000 feet, swirling with eerie hues of crimson and violet, visible from hundreds of miles away. It wasn't smoke from fires, it was something otherworldly, pulsing with an inner energy that defied explanation. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo received the first ground-level account from a survivor on a distant train line. The witness spoke of a blinding flash that outshone the sun, followed by a thunderous roar that hurled debris across valleys. The city skyline, once dotted with factories and homes vital to Japan's war machine, had been erased, leaving only smoldering ruins and a horizon of flames. Togo's notes captured the growing dread. This wasn't warfare as they knew it, it was a leap into the unknown. As the Supreme War Council assembled that afternoon, Prime Minister Kentaro Suzuki laid out the accumulating evidence with a steady voice, though his eyes betrayed the storm within. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are witnessing the dawn of a new era in human conflict." War Minister Korechika Anami, ever the staunch defender of continuation, dismissed it as Yankee trickery, a ploy to break their resolve. But Toyota countered sharply, "Our radars confirmed it. Our eyes saw it. 3 planes, Anami. How do we explain that?" The room grew heavy with unspoken fears. For nearly 4 years, Japan's doctrine had rested on 3 pillars. The vast Pacific distances would strain American supply lines. U.S. society, seen as decadent and casualty-averse, would crumble under prolonged losses, and Japanese tactical genius would offset numerical disadvantages. Pearl Harbor had been a gamble on these truths. Yet, battle after battle, from Midway's carrier losses to Guadalcanal's grueling attrition, had chipped away at them, though leaders reframed each setback as a test of spirit. Now this single event pierced the veil. Intelligence analyst Colonel Hideyuki Sato stepped forward with preliminary calculations. His voice steady, he revealed, "If one bomb can level a city the size of Hiroshima, then America's scientific edge isn't just superior, it's revolutionary. We've tracked their production, 300,000 aircraft built since 1941, against our 67,000. But this suggests hidden depths, projects we've only glimpsed in whispers." Togo voiced the collective thought. And if they have one such device, how many more lurk in their arsenals? The implications rippled outward. Japan had poured its soul into the war, rationing every resource, while America fought on two fronts, Europe and Asia, seemingly without strain. Reports from spies had long warned of massive U.S. research hubs, but they were brushed aside as exaggeration. Now the truth demanded reckoning. As the day wore on, more details emerged. The bomb's yield equated to 15,000 tons of TNT, dwarfing any conventional payload. Eyewitnesses from afar described winds that uprooted trees and a heat wave that ignited riverside vegetation. Sato's team cross-referenced it with known physics. This wasn't chemical. It hinted at atomic fission, a concept Japanese scientists had theorized but never pursued at scale due to resource constraints. The High Command's illusions began to crack. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's pre-war prophecy echoed hauntingly. He had predicted early successes but warned of America's inexhaustible might after the first year. He knew from his time in the U.S., studying at Harvard, touring factories, that their innovation stemmed from freedom and diversity, not rigid hierarchy. Ignored then, his words now haunted the bunker. By evening, the council adjourned in stunned silence, each man grappling with a paradigm shift. This wasn't just a weapon. It was proof that Japan had underestimated not merely an enemy, but an entire way of life. What secrets had America concealed while dominating the seas and skies? How had they built such power in shadows? The answers would unfold in the days ahead, reshaping history forever. But for now, the seed of doubt had taken root, promising revelations that no amount of resolve could ignore. The realization did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly like cold water seeping through cracked stone, until the entire foundation of Japanese strategic thinking began to dissolve. By the late afternoon of August 6, the Supreme War Council understood they were no longer debating military options. They were confronting an existential question. How do you fight an opponent who has already rewritten the rules of war while you were still playing by the old ones? Colonel Hideyuki Sato remained at the head of the room, his voice measured but carrying the weight of irreversible truth. He unrolled a series of charts his small intelligence section had quietly maintained for years, charts the High Command had repeatedly refused to take seriously. The first showed raw production numbers side by side. In 1944 alone, American shipyards launched 19 aircraft carriers. Japan managed 5. American factories turned out 96,000 combat aircraft that same year. Japan produced fewer than 29,000. But Sato did not stop at hardware. He pointed to a quieter, more terrifying statistic: electricity consumption. The Manhattan Project's secret cities, Oak Ridge, Hanford, Los Alamos, consumed more electrical power in 1944 than the entire industrial region of Kansai, home to Osaka, Kobe, and Kyoto combined. Entire towns had been built from nothing in remote American deserts and river valleys, staffed by 130,000 people, most of whom never knew the final purpose of their labor until the bombs fell. Sato's conclusion was devastating in its simplicity. They did not merely build a weapon. They built an industrial and scientific infrastructure so vast that we lacked the resources even to replicate the smallest part of it. Admiral Somu Toyota leaned forward, his fingers tracing the coastline of Honshu on the wall map. If they can afford to divert that much steel, concrete, uranium, and scientific talent while simultaneously supplying armies across two oceans, supplying the British, supplying the Soviets through Lend-Lease, then what we have witnessed is not their maximum effort. He paused, letting the sentence hang. This is what they accomplished with one hand behind their back. That single phrase, one hand behind their back, would echo through every conversation in the bunker over the coming days. It captured the most painful truth of all. America had never needed to fight Japan at full strength. They had fought a global coalition war, fed and armed allies on 3 continents, maintained civilian living standards higher than Japan's pre-war prosperity, and still found the capacity to develop and deploy a weapon that rendered entire cities obsolete in a single flash. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki broke the long silence. His voice was soft, almost reflective. For 4 years we told ourselves their democracy made them weak. Their individualism made them selfish. Their abundance made them soft. We convinced ourselves that spirit would always triumph over steel. He looked around the table at men who had spent decades building careers on that very belief. We were not merely mistaken. We were precisely wrong. Their system did not hinder innovation, it unleashed it. Their diversity did not fracture them, it brought them the best minds from every corner of the world. Their wealth did not corrupt them, it gave them the margin to dream impossible dreams. War Minister Korechika Anami's jaw tightened. He had spent the war insisting that one more decisive battle, one more display of national resolve, would force the Americans to negotiate. Now that position felt like shouting into a void. Yet he still spoke, his tone defiant. Even if their machines are superior, the Japanese people will never surrender their sacred soil. We will fight house by house, street by street. They will bleed until they beg for peace. General Yashijiro Yumizu raised a hand, stopping him. For the first time in memory, the stoic chief of staff spoke with something close to sorrow. Anami-san, if they can destroy cities without setting foot on them, there will be no houses left to defend, no streets left to fight in. The atomic bomb does not require occupation. It only requires delivery. Our entire doctrine of decisive homeland battle assumes they must come ashore. What if they never need to? The question landed like a physical blow. For years the army had planned for an invasion they believed would be so costly that American public opinion would force a compromise peace. The calculation had always been brutally simple. Inflict enough casualties and the Americans would quit. But a weapon that erased cities from 30,000 feet changed the arithmetic completely. Casualties no longer needed to be mutual. Destruction could now be delivered one-sidedly, relentlessly, and at a tempo Japan could never match. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo added the diplomatic dimension. We have been trying for months to use the Soviet Union as a mediator. Yesterday Molotov informed our ambassador that the USSR considers itself at war with Japan effective August 9. Our last diplomatic lifeline has been severed. There is no third power left that can intercede. We face America from the east, the Soviets from the north, and the British Commonwealth and Chinese forces from the south. And now we know the Americans hold a weapon that can reduce any city to ash in seconds. The room fell quiet again. Each man was performing the same mental arithmetic. How many cities could survive repeated atomic attack? Tokyo had already been firebombed into a wasteland. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama? How many more could vanish before the nation itself ceased to function? And if the Americans possessed multiple bombs, as logic now demanded they must, how long before nothing remained worth defending? As night fell on August 6, Suzuki requested a private audience with Emperor Hirohito. In the dimly lit chamber, the emperor listened without interruption as the prime minister recounted the day's events. When Suzuki finished, Hirohito spoke only a few words, but they carried the gravity of finality. We have reached the limit of endurance. The suffering of the people must not continue. Those quiet words marked the beginning of the end, not of the war itself, which still had 3 agonizing days to run, but of the illusion that Japan could dictate terms to history. The High Command had spent years telling themselves that American power had limits, that their own resolve had no limits. August 6 proved the opposite. American power appeared boundless, while Japan's capacity to endure was tragically finite. Yet even now, surrender was not immediate. Deeply ingrained beliefs, personal honor, fear of national humiliation, and the sheer momentum of 4 years of total war kept the machinery of resistance turning. The next 48 hours would become a desperate race between those who finally grasped the new reality and those who still refused to accept it. The story of Japan's surrender is often told as a single moment of decision. In truth, it was a slow, painful collapse of an entire worldview, one revelation at a time, one illusion after another stripped away until nothing remained but the stark truth. They had been fighting a civilization they never truly understood, and that civilization had only begun to show what it could do. The morning of August 7, 1945 dawned with a new kind of silence in Tokyo. No one shouted orders. No one issued defiant proclamations. The High Command moved through the bunker with the careful steps of men walking across thin ice, each aware that one wrong word could crack everything beneath them. Reconnaissance photographs finally arrived just before noon. Major Sunio Kitamura, who had flown the first successful mission over Hiroshima since the blast, described conditions his instruments could barely register. Violent updrafts that tossed his aircraft like paper, temperatures that spiked without warning, and a smoke column still rising in perfect symmetry to the edge of the stratosphere. The developed images showed devastation so absolute it defied military language. The central 4 square miles of Hiroshima had been reduced to bare, scorched earth. Not rubble, not twisted steel girders, not the familiar chaos of conventional firebombing, simply nothing. Buildings within half a mile of the hypocenter had not collapsed. They had ceased to exist. Analysts compared the photographs to the March 1945 Tokyo raid, which required 334 B-29s dropping nearly 1,700 tons of incendiaries over several hours. Hiroshima's destruction surpassed that in scale, speed, and completeness, yet it had been delivered by one aircraft in a fraction of a second. Colonel Sato placed the images on the table without ceremony. "This is not bombing," he said quietly. "This is erasure." Admiral Somu Toyota studied the prince for a long time before speaking. We have spent 4 years calculating how many tons of bombs it would take to destroy a city. We built shelters, trained fire brigades, dispersed factories. None of it matters anymore. One aircraft, one bomb, one moment, and a city the size of Hiroshima disappears. Our entire civil defense system was designed for the wrong war. Prime Minister Suzuki convened the Supreme War Council again at 1400 hours. The atmosphere had changed overnight. Even the most stubborn voices spoke more softly. Then came the second hammer blow. At midnight Moscow time, early morning Tokyo time, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov had handed Ambassador Naoto Sato a formal declaration. The Soviet Union would consider itself at war with Japan beginning August 9. The news reached the bunker just as the council began its session. General Korechika Anami's face drained of color. 4 months, Japanese diplomats had clung to the hope that Stalin would mediate a negotiated peace, preserving at least the imperial institution and some territory. That fantasy died in a single sentence. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo summarized the new strategic map with brutal clarity. We now face active fronts on every compass point. American carrier task forces and atomic bombs from the east. Soviet armored armies from the north. British and Commonwealth forces pressing from the south. Chinese armies still fighting in the interior. And we have no reserves left to shift, no allies to call upon, no diplomatic channel remaining. Suzuki looked around the table. We must be honest with ourselves. The question is no longer whether we can win. The question is whether Japan can survive as a nation. Anami tried one last time to rally the room. The people are prepared to fight to the last. If we demonstrate unbreakable will, the Americans will still seek terms. They fear prolonged occupation more than we fear death. General Yashijiro Yumizu shook his head slowly. They no longer need to occupy us to destroy us. That is the change we must accept. The atomic weapon allows them to bleed our cities one by one without ever landing a soldier on our soil. Our strategy of decisive homeland battle assumed mutual suffering. There will be no mutual suffering. There will only be our suffering. The words hung in the air. For the first time, the most senior officers began to speak of surrender not as treason, but as mathematics. Admiral Mitsumasa Yanai, the Navy Minister, spoke with rare candor. We have lost the ability to defend the home islands. Our fleets are gone. Our air forces are depleted. Our cities are vulnerable to a weapon we cannot intercept, cannot detect, cannot counter. Continuing the war does not preserve honor. It guarantees annihilation. As the meeting adjourned, Suzuki requested another private audience with the emperor. This time the conversation lasted longer. Hirohito listened to the updated reports, the photographs, the Soviet declaration, the unanimous assessments of the council. When Suzuki finished, the emperor spoke in a calm, measured tone that carried absolute authority. The time has come to bear the unbearable. We cannot allow our people to be destroyed for the sake of a pride that no longer serves them. I authorize you to explore every avenue that preserves the nation, even if the terms are severe. Those words were the turning point. Not because they immediately ended the war, military hardliners still resisted, but because they removed the final taboo. The emperor himself had acknowledged that continuation meant national suicide. From that moment, the momentum shifted irreversibly toward peace, even if the path remained jagged and dangerous. August 8 brought confirmation of the worst fears about Manchuria. The Soviet Red Army had launched a massive offensive at dawn. The once elite Guangdong Army, Japan's strategic reserve, was disintegrating. Soviet tank columns advanced 50 miles on the first day against forces equipped with American Lend-Lease trucks, jeeps, radios and fuel trucks. The irony was bitter. American industrial output had not only armed its own forces but had also equipped the very army now tearing through Japan's continental holdings. Then, at 11:02 on the morning of August 9, the second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The message from the regional command was even shorter than Hiroshima's. Atomic attack. City destroyed. Communication lost. The Supreme War Council convened in emergency session that afternoon. This time there was no debate about whether the weapon was real. There was only the grim arithmetic of how many more cities could disappear before nothing functional remained. Admiral Yanai spoke plainly. They have shown they can strike any target at will. We have no defense. We have no answer. Every hour we delay invites another city to vanish. General Yumizu, who had spent years preparing for the final battle, added his own reluctant conclusion. The atomic bomb has made invasion optional for them. They can reduce Japan to ash from the air. Our doctrine is obsolete. Resistance no longer buys time. It buys only more graves. As evening fell, Cabinet Secretary Hizutsun Sakimizu recorded the emperor's private reflection after receiving the latest reports. The unendurable must now be endured. We must choose the path that allows our people to live, even if that path is humiliating beyond imagination. Those 19 words, the unendurable must be endured, would later become the emotional core of Japan's surrender broadcast. But on the night of August 9th, they were still a private imperial verdict, not yet public policy. The final battle was no longer against America. It was inside the Japanese leadership itself, between those who could finally see reality and those who still preferred destruction to surrender. The clock was ticking. Every hour that passed increased the likelihood of a third bomb. And no one in the bunker doubted that America had more waiting. The hours following the Nagasaki bombing on August 9th felt like the final act of a play that had already ended, yet the actors refused to leave the stage. The Supreme War Council chamber was no longer filled with maps and confident markers. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier. Every man in the room understood that the next decision would determine whether Japan continued as a recognizable nation or vanished beneath successive flashes of unimaginable light. At 2:30 p.m. on August 9th, the council reconvened in emergency session. No one pretended this was a routine meeting. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki opened without preamble. We have received confirmation of the second atomic attack. Nagasaki no longer exists as a functioning city. We must now decide whether Japan will accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration or continue a resistance that can only lead to the annihilation of our people. Admiral Mitsumasa Yanai spoke first, his voice steady and unemotional. The Americans have demonstrated they can strike any target they choose at any time, with a weapon we cannot see coming and cannot stop. We have no air force capable of intercepting high-altitude bombers carrying this device. We have no radar system that can detect it in time. We have no civil defense that can protect against it. Every additional day of war invites another city to disappear. Osaka, Kyoto, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, how many more must we lose before we admit the obvious? General Yashijiro Yumizu, who had spent his entire career preparing for the decisive homeland battle, surprised everyone with his candor. I have always believed that our people's will to fight would force the enemy to negotiate. That belief rested on the assumption that any invasion would cost the Americans so dearly they would seek terms. The atomic bomb has removed that assumption. They no longer need to invade. They can simply continue destroying our cities until nothing remains worth defending. Our military doctrine is no longer valid. Continuing the war is no longer strategy. It is national suicide. Even War Minister Korechika Anami, the last and fiercest advocate of resistance to the end, spoke more quietly than usual. I still believe the Japanese spirit is unbreakable. But I cannot deny what we have seen. If we fight on, we invite the complete destruction of our cities, our culture, our people. Yet if we surrender now, we hand our sacred land to foreign occupation and place the emperor's sovereignty in doubt. I cannot easily accept either path. The room fell silent. For the first time in the war, no one rushed to fill the quiet with slogans or vows. The weight of reality had finally become too heavy to push aside with rhetoric. Suzuki then proposed the only realistic course left. We should accept the Potsdam Declaration with one condition, that the imperial institution be preserved. We transmit this offer through the Swiss and ask for clarification on the emperor's status. The vote was taken. 4 members, Suzuki, Togo, Yanai, and Admiral Keisuke Okada, representing the civilian side, voted to accept the declaration with the condition. Anami, Yumizu, and General Yashijiro Yumizu's deputy voted against. The council was deadlocked at 4-3. Suzuki then took the unprecedented step of requesting an imperial conference, a direct audience with Emperor Hirohito in the presence of the full council and senior statesmen. The meeting was convened at 11:30 p.m. on August 9th, deep in the imperial palace's air raid shelter. The emperor entered quietly and took his seat. He listened as each man presented his position. Suzuki spoke of the unbearable suffering already inflicted and the certainty of worse to come. Togo described the collapse of diplomacy. Yanai and Yumizu explained the military impossibility of further resistance. Anami made one final plea for a decisive homeland battle, arguing that national honor demanded it. When everyone had spoken, Hirohito remained silent for several long moments. Then he raised his head and addressed the room in a calm, deliberate voice that no one present would ever forget. I have listened carefully to all views. My conclusion is that continuing the war can only lead to the destruction of the Japanese people and the obliteration of our civilization. I cannot bear to see my innocent subjects suffer any longer. I have therefore decided to accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, provided the imperial institution is preserved in some form. This is my wish. This is my decision. The words struck the room like a physical force. Several men openly wept. Anime bowed deeply, tears streaming down his face. Yumizu sat motionless, staring at the floor. No one argued. No one dared. The emperor had spoken. In Japanese political and military culture, the imperial will was final. Immediately after the conference ended, Suzuki drafted the acceptance message, which was transmitted through Swiss channels in the early hours of August 10. Japan would accept the Potsdam terms on the sole condition that the prerogatives of His Majesty as a sovereign ruler be maintained. Washington received the message on August 10. President Truman and his advisors deliberated carefully. On August 12, the United States replied with deliberate ambiguity, "The ultimate form of government of Japan shall be established by the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. The emperor would be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers, but his final status would be decided later." The reply triggered one final crisis inside Japan. Hardliners, led by Anime and a group of younger officers, interpreted the American response as unacceptable. They argued that any surrender leaving the emperor's position uncertain was dishonorable. Plans were quietly discussed for a palace coup to prevent the surrender broadcast and force continued resistance. But the emperor's decision held firm. On August 14, another imperial conference was held. Hirohito again made his position clear. "I have already expressed my wish. I now command that you carry out my decision without further delay." That same evening, the cabinet formally voted to accept the Allied terms unconditionally, trusting the emperor's judgment that the nation's survival outweighed every other consideration. On the night of August 14 to 15, Hirohito recorded his surrender speech, the first time any Japanese emperor's voice had ever been broadcast to the public. The recording was smuggled out of the palace under heavy guard to prevent interference by coup plotters. At noon on August 15, 1945, the voice of the emperor, calm, measured, almost gentle, reached every corner of Japan through every available radio. After pondering deeply the general trends of the world and the actual conditions obtaining in our empire today, we have decided to effect a settlement of the present situation by resorting to an extraordinary measure. We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is insufferable. Millions of Japanese citizens heard those words and understood instantly, the war was over. In the Imperial General Headquarters, officers stood in stunned silence. Some saluted the portrait of the emperor. Others sat with their heads in their hands. The illusion that had sustained them for 4 years, that spirit could overcome any material disadvantage, had finally shattered against the reality of a civilization whose power they had never truly comprehended. Japan had not surrendered because it lacked courage. It surrendered because it had finally understood the scale of the force arrayed against it, and because one man, the emperor, chose the survival of his people over the pride of his empire. The formal surrender ceremony would take place weeks later aboard the USS Missouri. But the true surrender, the surrender of an entire worldview, happened in the quiet hours of August 14 and 15, 1945, when Japan's leaders looked at the impossible and chose life over annihilation. The formal surrender ceremony aboard the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, was not the moment Japan's leadership truly surrendered. That moment had already happened in the suffocating silence of the Imperial Palace bunker, in the Emperor's quiet words, in the hours when the last illusions finally collapsed. What took place in Tokyo Bay was the public acknowledgement of a truth the High Command had already accepted in private. They had been fighting a civilization whose power they had never truly measured. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu limped forward on his artificial leg to sign the instrument of surrender. He later wrote in his diary that the sight overwhelmed him more than any battlefield ever had. The harbor stretched out in every direction, filled with American warships, so many that the horizon seemed made of gray steel. Aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports, an armada so vast it appeared to swallow the sea itself. Above, wave after wave of aircraft flew in perfect formation, darkening the sky. This display was not a threat. It was a simple statement of fact. This was only a fraction of what America could put to sea and air on any given day. General Yashijiro Yumizu signed next, representing the Imperial General Staff. He stood rigid, face expressionless, but those who knew him saw the tremor in his hands. He later told occupation interrogators, "The Missouri was built in an American shipyard in less time than we needed to plan a single major fleet operation. We spent 10 years preparing for this war. They spent 15 months, and buried us." After the signatures, the ceremony ended quickly. There were no long speeches, no theatrical gestures. The Americans understood that the psychological wound was already deep. They did not need to twist the knife. In the weeks that followed, Japanese military observers and former high command members were given controlled access to American production figures, logistics systems, and occupation operations. The numbers confirmed everything they had feared and more. The United States had produced 88,410 tanks 257,000 artillery pieces 434,000 military trucks 17 million rifles 41 billion rounds of ammunition 300,000 combat aircraft 124 aircraft carriers of all types. All of this while maintaining civilian production levels that exceeded Japan's pre-war prosperity. American families still bought new cars, refrigerators, washing machines. Factories that made bombers by day switched to consumer goods by night. The economy never fully converted to war footing, because it never had to. The Manhattan Project itself was gradually revealed to Japanese scientists under occupation supervision. They learned of entire secret cities built in months. Oak Ridge with its sprawling gaseous diffusion plants, Hanford with its plutonium reactors, Los Alamos with its concentrated brain trust. The project employed 130,000 people at its peak and cost roughly $2 billion. More than Japan's entire military expenditure in 1944. It consumed more electricity than entire Japanese industrial regions. It drew on the collective genius of universities, private industry, and immigrant scientists from across the world. Admiral Somu Toyoda, in a 1946 conversation recorded by occupation historians, offered one of the most candid assessments. "We began the war believing American democracy made them weak, their diversity made them divided, their wealth made them soft. We ended it understanding the opposite. Their democracy unleashed innovation. Their diversity brought them the finest minds on earth. Their wealth gave them the margin to attempt things we could not even imagine. Every belief we held was not just wrong, it was precisely backwards." Colonel Hideyuki Sato compiled what became known as the Why We Lost report in late 1945. Preserved today in Japan's National Institute for Defense Studies, it is brutally direct. We lost the war the day we attacked an enemy we did not understand. Every campaign after Pearl Harbor was simply the working out of inevitable mathematics. Their industrial capacity exceeded ours by factors of 10 to 20 in every category. Their scientific establishment was larger than our entire educated population. Their resource base was functionally unlimited. We believed spirit could overcome material. We were catastrophically mistaken. The occupation period brought further revelations. A single American infantry division arrived with more trucks than the entire Imperial Army had possessed at its peak. American supply depots delivered fresh meat, vegetables, and medical supplies to troops while Japanese soldiers had starved. American field hospitals performed surgeries that Japanese military medicine considered impossible. Former Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, in conversations with American historians, summarized the final lesson. "We thought we were fighting a nation of merchants who valued profit over honor, comfort over sacrifice. We were wrong. We were fighting the most productive civilization in human history, one that could simultaneously sustain a mass consumer economy and total war production. They did not choose between butter and guns. They produced both in quantities we found incomprehensible." By 1947, when occupation authorities conducted in-depth interviews with surviving members of the wartime high command, the transformation was complete. General Umezu, once the embodiment of unyielding resolve, gave testimony that still echoes. "We lost because we never understood our enemy. We projected our own limitations onto them, limited resources, narrow industrial base, rigid thinking, when they possessed the opposite in every respect. We believed our own propaganda when we should have believed our intelligence. The atomic bomb was not the cause of our defeat. It was the final proof that we had been defeated from the moment we began fighting an enemy we never truly comprehended." He paused, then added the sentence that perhaps captures the deepest truth of all. "Courage cannot defeat chemistry. Spirit cannot overcome steel. And determination means nothing when your opponent possesses both determination and 10 times your capacity to turn it into physical reality." In the end, Japan's surrender was not merely the end of a war. It was the death of a worldview, one that had placed national spirit above material reality, honor above survival, illusion above evidence. The High Command had spent years convincing themselves that America could be defeated through willpower. Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced them to see that they had been measuring themselves against a civilization that had barely exerted itself. And that realization, that America had fought the entire war with one hand behind its back, was perhaps the most humbling lesson of all.